Okay, so for our third talk of the day, we have the fourth lecture of Rafael Potrie about collapse Anosov flow. Rafael.
Okay, thank you very much. So today I will try to explain some ways to show that a partially hyperbolic dynamical system belongs to the class we described yesterday. And then I will try to kind of give a panorama of some of the things we know how to do, and more interestingly, some of the things we don't know how to do. Okay, and so let me remind you the definition of collapsed Anosov flow we discussed yesterday. And collapsed Anosov flow was a partially hyperbolic diffeomorphism. I'm hoping you recall what this means, which came associated with an Anosov flow, a self-orbit equivalence of this Anosov flow, which was a kind of a permutation of the orbits of the flow, and a semi-conjugacy between the self-orbit equivalence and the partially hyperbolic map. Additionally, we require some condition which kind of relates the Anosov structure with the partially hyperbolic structure. Okay, and this was to remove some potential bad behavior and actual bad behavior that could happen. Okay, and let me make two drawings because okay, I will come back to this drawing. So the goal of today, the first main goal will
Rafael,
be.
may I ask a question?
Yes.
So what do you expect to collapse going from phi to f is what? Is like pieces of orbits or collections of orbits of the Anosov flow?
So rays of orbits, I expect some rays of orbits of the Anosov flow to be collapsed into the same curve tangent to the center. Okay, so this okay. Condition here is telling you that the orbits of the flow are mapped into curves tangent to the center direction of the partially hyperbolic system. And since the center direction is a one-dimensional bundle, but it's typically non-Lipschitz, then it has integral curves, but these curves could merge. They have this behavior like in the differential equations, which are less than Lipschitz. You find this behavior, and so you will find some curves that touch and then continue together. And what I expect this map H is to describe this merging of the orbit.
Thanks.
Okay. And so to simplify a little bit the things I will make for today, I will make some standing assumptions. The first one is somewhat harmless, but it's not so harmless if you want to actually do some stuff. But for today, I will make the assumption that all the bundles are orientable and that the differential of f preserves the orientation on each. Okay, and this is a condition that you can always have if you take a finite cover and you take an iterate. Okay, and so if we want to show that f relates to an Anosov flow and a self-orbit equivalence, the first thing we want to do, and that's my first point today, is to understand how do Anosov flows look like. Okay, and so that's why I made these two drawings that then I will explain. So an Anosov flow has a behavior like this. So you have orbits of the flow, and through each orbit of this flow, you have two transverse foliations, the weak stable and so this is the weak stable and this is the weak unstable, on which the orbits do as it's suggested by this drawing. Okay, so you take in the weak unstable, if you flow an arc like here, it will become larger, and in the center stable, if you take a strong stable manifold, you flow it forward, it will become shorter. And as I said yesterday, so a good model to understand this foliation is to think of leaves of the foliation in the universal cover as hyperbolic disks, on which you are thinking of the orbits of the flow as geodesics, all landing in the same point at infinity. And the stable manifolds are the horocycles going around like this. Okay, so let me state that more precisely. If you have an Anosov flow on a closed tree manifold, then it will preserve two transverse foliations, the weak stable and the weak unstable, and they have the following properties. The leaves of each one of the foliations are trivially bifoliated by orbits of the strong stable and strong unstable foliation, by the orbits and the strong unstable or strong unstable foliation. This is this drawing here. By trivially bifoliated, I mean this, the interior of this is homeomorphic to the plane with these two foliations here, these two transverse foliations. Okay, but in terms of the dynamics and the geometry, it's more, it's better to think it this way, but they are the same foliation as the two trivial foliations by horizontals and verticals in the plane. Okay. And the second condition on this foliation is that all leaves of these two foliations are cylinders and planes. I am assuming everything is orientable, so Möbius bands cannot exist. And in fact, when you have an Anosov flow, if you look at the center stable leaf of a periodic orbit, then it will be a cylinder. And if your center stable or center unstable leaf does not have any periodic orbit, then it's a plane. Okay, and then you have your manifold is foliated by two transverse foliations, each of which has these two properties and these sub-foliations inside. Okay, so and why, and now I will try to explain why this drawing makes a lot of sense. Okay, so we will pick a leaf of the weak stable foliation, say in the universal cover, and the point I want to make is that this leaf has to be Gromov hyperbolic. It's very much like a negatively curved surface. Okay, so the fact that it's negatively curved is not obvious, not even necessarily true, because all these objects we are looking are independent on the metric, so that the right way to state it is saying it's Gromov hyperbolic, which essentially for a plane means it's quasi-isometric to the hyperbolic plane. And this is an old result by Sergio Fenley, and it's not very difficult. You can use a result by candle to get this, but you can do it by hand too. And the idea is that to show that a surface is Gromov hyperbolic, it's enough to show that the growth of volume inside the leaves is exponential. And to see this, it's enough to show that if you take a stable arc of length 1 and you flow it backwards for a time t, then you get over here a stable arc of length more or less exponential in t. And since in each point of this curve you have like a local product structure box which has a uniform volume, you get that in the ball of radius, say t plus 1 around x, because you move here less than 1 and then you flow a length t, so you find a curve of length less than t, you have exponentially many disjoint balls of the same volume. So the volume of a ball of radius t plus 1 is exponential in t. And this is the same as being Gromov hyperbolic. Okay, so this is something general about Anosov flows. And once we are quasi-isometric to H2, we can start trying to play with the Morse lemma that appears in other mini courses in the school. The important fact, which is also not very hard to show, but I won't do it, is that the orbits of the lifted flow inside the leaves of the foliations are quasi-geodesics. And so this implies that every orbit of the flow is a quasi-geodesic. And of course, if I'm looking the center stable foliation, I know that if two orbits are in the same leaf of the center stable foliation, they should approach when going to infinity. So you will have a drawing like this of the foliation by quasi-geodesics inside the leaf. This is what we will call a quasi-geodesic fan, okay, like a fan to ventilate. And this point is called the funnel point of the quasi-geodesic fan, meaning that all of the orbits are landing in this point at infinity. Okay, so now that we understand the structure of Anosov flows in three manifolds, or at least part of its structure, let me try to introduce a criteria which is very useful in the practice to show that a partially hyperbolic system is a collapsed Anosov flow. Unfortunately, just to describe the criteria, I need to introduce additional structure on partially hyperbolic systems, which is somewhat technical. So I will stop some minutes to explain that. But the point here is that this structure I will introduce is very heavy in terms of notation and things, but it's a structure that it's guaranteed for partially hyperbolic systems, at least under our standing assumptions of orientability of the bundles. So it's something that exists. We don't know how it looks like, but it exists. And therefore, it's something we can start thinking about and trying to use the structure we already know to have information on how it looks. So there is a result, a very important result by Burago Ivanov, who showed that, who produced a way to understand the potential non-integrability of the center direction. Okay, they produce what they call branching foliations, which are certain objects I will describe now, which will be F invariant and tangent to the center stable and center unstable bundles. Okay, so this way, it's a nice way to reduce the dimensional study of a partially hyperbolic system. So we were in a three-dimensional setting, and we are going to partition our space into two-dimensional stuff and try to see what we can say about the structure inside these two-dimensional stuff. So what is a branching foliation? It's a collection of surfaces tangent to a certain bundle. So in this case, this one will be tangent to this bundle, and this one will be tangent to this bundle, which, if we leave to the universal cover, M tilde, they have the following properties. The first property is that each leaf of the branching foliation is a properly embedded plane. Okay, it's a surface homeomorphic to the plane, and such that the embedding into the universal cover, this universal cover is homeomorphic to R3 typically. I want to explain why, but it's a consequence of this theorem that this space is homeomorphic to R3, and therefore it will, a properly embedded plane, is like by Jordan separation theorem, cuts your space in two half spaces, which I'm calling L plus and L minus, which intersect in L. Okay, so I have a surface, properly embedded surface inside M3, and I'm taking the upper space and the lower space, which intersect in the leaf L. And so the property the leaves of this branching foliation have, which is the thing that allows us to use the theory of foliations in these objects, is the non-crossing property, meaning that if I have a leaf and another leaf, this is L, and another leaf L prime, so they can touch, but they cannot cross. Okay, so This I'm writing it like this. If I have two leaves, then the other L prime will be contained in one of the half spaces of L. And finally, this object is non-empty, and it's as rich as we can expect, because every point belongs to at least one leaf. Okay, so this is the structure provided by this theorem, and here is a two-dimensional drawing of how these kind of things have to look like. Okay, they can touch, but they cannot cross, and they cover all the manifold. Okay, and so to be able to continue, I won't need, but I will make another simplifying assumption, which is that these branching foliations are minimal, in the sense that every leaf in the manifold is dense. Okay, and this is verified in many important cases, for instance, when F is transitive or is volume preserved. Okay, but this is not needed. It will allow me to make some shortcuts and try to explain the idea hopefully more clearly. Okay, so in this setting, if we have this branching foliation and if it's F minimal, there's an abstract, a general result on foliations that allows us to show that if the manifold is big enough to admit an Anosov flow, because otherwise it won't admit an Anosov flow, and if it's big enough, then a foliation like this is automatically verifies that every leaf is Gromov hyperbolic. So this way we already have a relationship with Anosov flows.
Sorry, Rafael, can I ask you a question?
Yes.
So in the list, you cannot have periodic orbits, because this will give that the CS or CU leaf will be a cylinder, right? And you are asking to be like planes.
No, sorry. This is in the universal cover, right?
Yeah, so in the universal cover, you don't have periodic orbit, all they open.
Yeah, there won't be, so you need to show that, but there cannot be also. So what is a periodic orbit in the universal cover? No, you can't have it. It depends on the lift you choose. If you have a periodic orbit in the manifold that typically you will have, then you can find a lift of F to the universal cover, which will have periodic points. But these periodic points don't need to be related with topology of the leaf. It's not like in the Anosov flow, you know that a periodic orbit belongs to an orbit of the flow, and it produces a circle inside. But here you could have, and in fact the examples I gave yesterday, you have like fixed points which are related to centers that project to lines and are a contraction. Okay, so
perhaps a similar question could be: can you have a closed center leaf in this case?
You can have a closed center leaf, and a closed center leaf will correspond to some deck transformation here that fixes a leaf of the foliation. Okay, so in the universal, this is equivalent. So let me tell you the reason I define this in the universal cover is because these leaves, when I take a deck transformation, I can have a leaf like this, L, and I take a deck transformation gamma, and the leaf will touch itself but won't coincide. So in the manifold, this means that the leaf is like a plane coming like here and then touching itself and then becoming like a cylinder. And this could happen, and it's more complicated. So to define the non-crossing condition in the manifold, you need to do like local charts, and it's more complicated. So, but here I'm not obstructing any possible topology. So the surfaces could be infinite genus. So in the manifold, because you have subgroups of the fundamental group of your manifold, which could be very ugly, and they produce some topology of your of your leaf in the manifold. So a priori, we know nothing, but we know something. So this theorem tells us the leaves are Gromov hyperbolic, which is something. Okay. So in particular, there cannot be torus leaf. Okay, that's something.
Rafael, sorry,
Yes.
just to make sure. So when you go to the lift, you cannot have this cylinder, for instance. This is not obvious when you take lift of any foliation, but I think you have some small arguments that in these cases, the lift all of them should be really plain.
Yes. So
some
here,
kind of Novikov type. Yeah.
Here I'm putting together two theorems inside one, if you want.
Exactly.
But
Yeah,
I want to start with the structure, and I'm like this paper is very long. It has a lot of things. I'm including all the things in only one statement.
Just answering Mauritius. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
Just so in particular, if you are dynamically coherent, the branching foliation is not necessarily the true foliation.
No. So
Okay.
if you are dynamically coherent, the foliation is a branching foliation, but there could be many.
Mm-hmm.
And there are examples where you have many. And in fact, so I won't enter too much into these things, but one important problem is to describe all the possible branching foliation, and whether for collapse Anosov flows, you have only one way to be like this. This is relevant if you want to start discussing the problems I said at the beginning of taking finite covers and then projecting back and stuff like that. Then you start messing with this kind of problems. But right now, so the only statement I make is there exists one pair of branching foliations, and I want to describe a criteria to say whether this pair of branching foliations induces the structure of a collapse Anosov flow or not. Okay, and the object I have for free is a Gromov hyperbolic structure in each one of the leaves. And by that, I mean, you can think of each of the leaves in the universal cover as a hyperbolic plane. And so now I can make a definition, and I will say that F is a leafwise quasi-geodesic partially hyperbolic system if the center curves inside each one of these leaves are quasi-geodesics. Okay, and center curves, by center curves, I mean connected components of the intersection. So there could be many connected components, but I'm saying that connected components of the intersection of these leaves are quasi-geodesics inside each one of the leaves of the foliation. Okay. So this is just a definition. And the goal, so, and this definition, it's difficult because it requires this additional structure of branching foliations, but it's convenient because when you start trying to, if I give you, so for instance, I will explain later, for instance, one result we have with Sergio that says, if in a hyperbolic tree manifold, every partially hyperbolic system is a collapse Anosov flow. Okay, and to show that, what can you do? So you start with a partially hyperbolic system. Okay, you take a finite lift, a finite iterate. You have branching foliations, and then, well, what can you do? And what we do is we try to study the interaction between the geometry and the topology of the manifold with the partially hyperbolic system to show that every center curve is a quasi-geodesic. And then we apply the criteria I will explain to deduce that we have a collapse Anosov flow. In particular, the manifold admits an Anosov flow. But so this is a useful criteria, and it's useful in two ways. Because it, as we said, so for collapse for Anosov flows, the flow lines are quasi-geodesic in the leaves. So you expect, so the collapse Anosov flows will be leaf-wise quasi-geodesic. And having this quasi-geodesic property, as we explained last time, allows us to relate the big scale dynamics of F with the dynamics of the center curves. And so we can understand the dynamics of the partially hyperbolic system by understanding the big scale behavior, which is essentially what we do when we study dA partially hyperbolic in T3. We try to use the big scale to understand the dynamics. Okay, and so let me state the result is if you are leaf-wise quasi-geodesic, then you are collapse Anosov flow. Okay, so from this quasi-geodesic structure, we can produce the Anosov flow, the self-orbit equivalent, and the map H conjugating the two. Okay, and this involves many steps, and I will only concentrate in one of the steps, which is how to go from centers are quasi-geodesics in each center stable leaf to centers are quasi-geodesic fan in each one. Okay, I will only concentrate on that. So this theorem has many parts, but I will concentrate in that one because I think it's something I can do in a mini course. Okay, and okay, a consequence of this is that if centers are quasi-geodesic in each leaf, then M admits an Anosov flow, which a priori is not given. So we are starting with a partially hyperbolic system. As I said, the leaves could be infinite genus or have like a finite genus, but infinite area. There are many possibilities, but now I'm saying a posteriori, every leaf will be a cylinder and a plane. Okay, that is not the hard part, but okay. So let me give you a drawing of the enemies. Okay, I'm drawing here foliations by quasi-geodesics in the hyperbolic disk, which are not the ones we like.
Sorry, one question.
Yes.
It's a side question. If these quasi-geodesics are unique, assume that for some reason, meaning that the center is integrable.
Yes.
Of course, they are not coming from a geometry. They are not geodesic for a Riemannian geometry. But can you have some kind of non-smooth geometry that will realize this quasi-geodesic? So the quasi-geodesic
Yes,
is some center minimizer in some geometry.
So this Candle theorem tells you that you can find a metric which is smooth along the leaves but only continuous transversally.
Yes.
Which makes each one of the leaves a hyperbolic plane, and the orbits you can make your flow orbit equivalent to one which is the geodesic fan inside the weak stable. Of course, you cannot do both at the same time, but you can do that.
With respect to this non-smooth geometry, these quasi-geodesics, they are going to be minimizers.
Yes, the orbits are the geodesics of this metric in this list.
Okay, good, excellent.
Yeah, and in fact, so when we try to show this, so what I will explain next in the next, say, 5 or 8 minutes is how to show this, that if it's leaf-wise quasi-geodesic, then in each leaf, it's a quasi-geodesic fan like this. Orbits are going like this. And so there are 4 enemies that I draw here. But this one is it's a different enemy, because here the problem here is it's a quasi-geodesic fan, but the problem is uniqueness of quasi-geodesic going to that point. And so I will only explain how to remove these 3 things. This one is more difficult. But okay.
So you work the way around, no? So instead of saying, so you have this flow, no, sorry, you have this non-smooth metric that in certain way produce this geodesic, and they have this property that in certain planes, they are those hyperbolic planes, etc. the flow, at least, well, it's not smooth because the metric is not smooth, but can you say at least that it's expansive?
Yeah, so that's the point. Once you show that in each center stable, you're a geodesic fan like this, then you will use this to show that the flow is expansive.
Okay.
And since it preserves a foliation, it's a topological Anosov flow, then you can use this Shannon's result.
Does there exist a theory like this, just just analyzing this type of non-smooth geometry?
Yes. So we actually use all of that after we produce this. We use all of that, and then we need to produce the self-orbit equivalent. That, remember, the self-orbit equivalence is more than a way to permute the orbits. It's also telling you to which point you send each point. So to construct that, there's some additional work, but I won't enter in that. But yes, all of that is part of the proof of this theorem. I'm just saying a little part of this.
Thank you.
Okay, so let me say a couple of words about this, just to give some arguments. So as you can see in these drawings, so first you need to show that these are essentially all the possible foliations of the plane by quasi-geodesic, of the hyperbolic plane by quasi-geodesic. That is not so hard, but I won't do it. But the interesting thing is that for these three families, there are two distinguished points at infinity. While for this one, which is the one we want, there's only one distinguished point. Okay, but the fact that there are distinguished points already tells you something about the stabilizer of each leaf by the fundamental group. So the leaves, the orbits, the deck transformation that fix a leaf has to be cyclic. And therefore, the leaf projects to a cylinder or a plane. Okay, so this is just a trivial consequence of the fact that you have distinguished points, and deck transformations will need to, if you preserve the leaf, you need to preserve the distinguished points. And since the metric is hyperbolic in the scene, so the action inside the surface, it's a hyperbolic isometry. And so hyperbolic isometry is acting properly on the hyperbolic plane with only two fixed points. If they share the fixed point, one is an iterate of the other. Okay. So this is some hyperbolic geometry. I won't use this, but I wanted to make the remark. And the actually important argument is to show that, and that's why I will also use this simplifying assumption, because otherwise it's much harder, is to show that there's at least one weak quasi-geodesic fan, and these weak quasi-geodesic fans form a closed and equivariant set. And so if it's minimal, then everyone is a quasi-geodesic fan. And so the question is how to produce this quasi-geodesic fan. And the idea is to use deck transformations to produce some contraction. And whatever your drawing is, you have geodesic like this. And so if you look in a compact part, the geodesics need to separate a lot. And so you will find disks going to infinity, which are arbitrarily large, and whose geodesics in very long time, they remain close and they arrive to a fixed size. So if you take the deck transformation, sending this disk to a compact part, so this point, you send it here, and so this disk will be something like this, and this disk here will be something very small over here. And you know that every geodesic there will arrive to this small disk, and so in the limit, you produce weak quasi-geodesic fans. Okay, and then is the argument I was saying that I will go quick because I want to do the rest of the talk. So this is the set of leaves which are quasi-geodesic fans is closed and invariant under the fundamental group. Since we show this non-empty, the minimality tells you that it's everything. And then to rule out the weak quasi-geodesic fans, we need to rule out this behavior And this is actually, it looks simple, but it's harder. So the only argument we have requires using the quasi-geodesic property in both foliations at the same time. We don't know how to do it with only one foliation. If we had a partially hyperbolic system with only one foliation. And maybe it's not, well, there's no statement that would make sense to say it's false, but the arguments require using the fact that you are partially hyperbolic and the transverse foliation. So as you see, the argument here is just, it's pretty general. It's about quasi-geodesic foliations inside a foliation. But then this argument involves using the partial hyperbolicity. That's all I wanted to say. That's the proof part of today's talk. And the insight or the upshot I wanted to emphasize is that knowing that centers are quasi-geodesic, which implies that they are uniformly quasi-geodesic, it's very comfortable to understanding the dynamics, because quasi-geodesics are mapped to quasi-geodesics, and quasi-geodesics behave very well by taking limits. Okay, so yesterday I was making some drawings of families of curves that when you go to infinity, they split and they limit into many curves. But quasi-geodesic cannot do that. So if you handle it's enough to understand the dynamics in the boundary to understand the dynamics of the leaves. And that is very important and very useful in general to understand these options. Okay, so now let me say some few things that we know how to do with this and the many things that we would like to know how to do with these things. So with Sergio, we show that if you have a hyperbolic tree manifold and a partially hyperbolic diffeomorphism, then it's leafwise quasi, or it's a collapse Anosov flows. And here, and the corollary is that the manifold meets an Anosov flow. But here it's important to say that we are not assuming the orientability conditions. And that's important because if you have an Anosov flow in a tree manifold, the obstructions we know for existence of Anosov flows in hyperbolic tree manifolds are very sensible to take infinite covers. Okay, so the fact that we are not assuming that we are taking finite covers, it's important in the result and it's very expensive in the proof. But but the proof starts by going to a finite cover and finding some uniqueness properties in order to be able to descend later to that. Okay, so and this result it also builds on previous results we obtained with Barthelme and Frankel, which deal with general partially hyperbolic systems homotopic to the identity, and which aim to describe precisely the case when F is a discretized Anosov flow, which is something I discussed last time. And in general, we could make the following totally general question of whether every partially hyperbolic diffeomorphism may be transitive in a closed string manifold with non-virtually solvable fundamental group has to be a collapsed Anosov flow. And this we don't know. And it actually could be. So let me say a few words about why we use the fact that M is hyperbolic here. And the reason is that we have a very good understanding of the topology and geometry of hyperbolic tree manifolds that gave us some tools to address some like tricky points in the proof. But the approach is completely general. And for instance, if we start understanding that there's no theory of understanding of, instead of having a manifold and an isotopy class, if you have a manifold with a foliation and you try to understand the dynamics of general maps preserving foliations seen from infinity, there's no theory of that, but it makes sense to create such a theory, and understanding that would allow to push many of the arguments here to general cases. Okay, and I don't know the answer to this question, but at least what I'm claiming is that this approach could make sense to be pushed in general. Okay. Okay, so also what can we say about the dynamics of collapsed Anosov flows in general? So I point out here one theorem we showed with Sergio Fenley. So if you have a volume preserving diffeomorphism.
So say it again. So you say that only focusing on diffuse that preserve foliations, forget about partially hyperbolic, etc. And because there isn't the hyperbolic manifold, then you could look how those foliation sit in infinity. And
yes,
this analysis you never use. So how? So okay, so you have your foliation or whatever, the stable, the strong, stable, the strong, unstable, the stable and unstable list, and the center in some collapse way. But do you use strongly the property of being dominated of foliations?
Yes, so we use everything, but one key aspect of the proof is to plug in the dynamics at infinity to understand the dynamics of center curves. Okay, so that's the starting point. And after that starting point, the arguments are more partially hyperbolic-like arguments, which require partial hyperbolicity, but maybe some of them are more standard. But what I'm claiming here is that instead of, so if you look in the unit tangent bundle of a surface, as we were doing last time, so the key point to understand that case, so we have a work in progress with Fenley doing the case of M cipher three manifolds and showing the same result. To do that, we use very strongly the Nielsen-Thurston classification theorem, which describes the dynamic at infinity of this. In general, what I claim is that there could be a theory that it's not developed of foliation preserving maps in three manifold, which in terms of how the dynamics moves the leaves of the foliation in the universal cover, forces dynamics at infinity, and would be very much like a Nielsen-Thurston classification theorem.
Did you assume a priori that there is whatever foliation or whatever dynamic you have, the foliation that is preserved induce a dynamic at infinity?
Yes.
Does it help?
Well, yes, but the question, so we are introducing here some notions of super attracting points, super repelling points, motivated by like complex dynamics and stuff like that, and so in the boundary of the leaves, which are hyperbolic planes, you have like a quasi-symmetric structure that allows you to talk about these kind of things.
So the problem basically is to induce a dynamic in infinity. It's not clear that if you mapping preserve a foliation, etc., is going to induce a dynamic in infinity.
Or more importantly, understand how this dynamics looks like, and if it's all like the and this is like one problem, but yes. Okay, so in terms of dynamics, so my claim is that assuming collapse Anosov flow and forgetting about classification, so you don't care about classification, you start by assuming that you are a collapse Anosov flow and hoping that this is a very general class. You can ask dynamical questions. And so this is an instance of this. So with Sergio, we showed that if you have a volume preserving collapse Anosov flow, then it's ergodic on K-system or whatever. And the argument uses the Anosov flow, but also uses some other tools related to the fact that we understand very well this kind of things. But for instance, we don't know if it's Bernoulli for volume preserving. And in the non-conservative case, there are mostly open questions. So physical measure, maximal entropy, whatever, the chain recurrence. There are many questions you can try to address, or uniqueness of attractors, or finiteness, or whatever. Okay, and finally, let me point out, I close with this question, which I think it's also somewhat urgent and it's not resolved yet, which is whether every self-orbit equivalence of an Anosov flow can be realized by some collapsed Anosov flow. So last time we described some self-orbit equivalences which are non-trivial and realized by partially hyperbolic system, but right now we don't know if every one of them can be that. Okay, because we use this very magical trick of moving along the Teichmuller space of a surface and whatever. But this, technically, it's just a trick. What it means is that we are able to understand the structure of the foliations and to produce a map which preserves the transversality and looks like the self-orbit equivalent. So if you have a self-orbit equivalence, it's a homeomorphism. If you can approach it by a diffeomorphism that preserves transversalities, you will be able to answer this question. And so in a certain sense, I say this is kind of an astronomy problem, because we now decided which should be the classes, and we know where the planet is, but now we need to build the telescope to see these planets. And this is still undone. And this is also an open question. And okay, and this was what I wanted to share.
Like finding Pluto.
Yeah.
So they say Pluto is over there. Now chat, try to look it.
Yeah.
But do you know anything about this question for algebraic example, geodesic flows, for instance, or not even?
Well, for geodesic flows, we produced all the possible self-orbit equivalence with the argument we did two lectures ago.
Okay.
So you can, it requires showing that these are all possible self-orbit equivalences, which we can do too.
Okay, so we have good support for this question.
And there are other classes where we know how to do self-orbit equivalences, but each time we have like an ad hoc method to understand the foliations and do. But in principle, it could be possible. So at that point, we didn't know that this came from self-orbit equivalence. It was just finding new partially hyperbolic system. Now that we know, and we know that they are related to this, we know where to look for one. And we can try to produce this transversality to produce new examples. And this would produce, for instance, we could produce examples which are homotopic to identity and not discretized Anosov flows.
Okay, so thanks, Rafael. Let's thank Rafael for the talk and for the mini course.